Welcome to day 2 of the Stockholm Security Conference. My name is Sibylle Bauer and I'm Director of Studies for Armament and Disarmament here at SIPRI. We have 4 thematic days at the Stockholm Security Conference. Today we'll be focusing on technology. Yesterday it was international law, tomorrow strategies and doctrines, and on Thursday the protection of civilians. And we will be concluding the conference with the Peace Prize ceremony in Ypres, Belgium, which will connect us back to battlefields of the past. Today we'll have 5 sessions. After this quantum technology session, we'll have a session on hacking nuclear deterrence, cyber threats to nuclear systems, then 2 parallel sessions, one on offense, defense, race in space, missile defense, anti-satellite weapons and nuclear arms control, and also at the same time, human mind as a battlefield. And we will conclude with missile proliferation. So plenty of food for thought there today. But now on to quantum technologies. I've been personally very much looking forward to this session. We've all heard about quantum, but there are very few people on this planet who really understand quantum technologies in all their complexities and applications. Quantum physics, of course, is not new. Technology is always evolving. Their civilian and military applications are evolving. And as Patricia has mentioned to me before, it takes a poet to translate poetry, but also it takes a physicist to explain physics. So there are some people who argue that it's too difficult to translate poetry, so one shouldn't do that. But if you don't, that means that this poetry remains accessible only to a very limited group of people, and it's the same with physics. So it's actually very important that we have people who are able and willing to explain their knowledge with us. And we are very fortunate that today we have with us Patricia Luis, who in the first part of her career was very much focused on the natural science world, far away from policy, far away from the social sciences, and far away from research institutions focusing on international security. Fortunately for us, that changed. So Patricia had a lot of different functions in her career, including as director of UNIDIR, as director of Vertic, working for the Monterey Institute, being on the Blix Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction, and now as research director for international security at Chatham House, and also on the governing board of SIPRI. So I'm very grateful, Patricia, that you will be able to enlighten us about this very complicated subject. We have quantum computers, we have quantum sensing, we have quantum communications, they're all at different stages. We now very much look forward to you explaining the state of development and deployment, what we can expect, how they will be applied in the military battle space, how they might be applied. And there'll be afterwards an opportunity, first of all, for me to ask some follow-up questions, then for the audience to ask questions. Feel free to already do that while Patricia is talking. You should use for that the Q&A function. Please don't use it to make statements. It's only there for you to ask questions, and I will then put them to Patricia. So with that, over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much indeed, Sibylle, and thank you to SIPRI and the Stockholm Security Conference for inviting me to speak. And I'm delighted to see everybody on this call, and I hope that we'll get into a really good discussion as soon as possible. So I think what we need to understand about the new quantum technologies is that we're really on the cusp of another technological revolution. And if you look back over the last century, we can see how the understanding of quantum physics transformed our world. The first wave of quantum technologies were not called quantum technologies. They were based, though, on quantum effects. They called them transistors, computers, lasers, all the imaging capabilities that we have, all of our digital, our communications, equipment. And of course, so much of our current energy production has been made possible by the application of the mathematics and physics that we developed to describe and understand the subatomic world. And as a result of this, we've been able to connect and communicate in ways previously only imaginable. And extraordinary advancements have been made in medical diagnostics and treatment, and of course in the applications of military technology as well. And I think it's really important that we take a moment just to recognize that, and to recognize that with all of its problems, these technologies have been revolutionary. And there would be very few of us, I think, who would want to go back to the days before that in terms of what we are able to have. And I think we must recognize that for all their problems that they've introduced us to, we've also got a huge number of benefits. The world of quantum applications has not stood still, and new quantum technologies are now in development and actually in deployment, which are going to also transform human activity. And this so-called second wave of quantum technologies harnesses the specific aspects of subatomic particle behavior called superposition and entanglement. They're two things that are really behind this. Superposition describes the property of a particle being in two or more states at once. And entanglement is when two particles are so connected that they are one whole system, not two separate components, even when the two particles are separated by thousands of kilometers. And these characteristics are fundamental to the way our world works. And part of the problem, I think, and we can get into this, Sibylle, later, is that we're not taught this at an early age. And because we don't see these effects except under certain conditions, we don't witness them at an early age. And then we're introduced to them much later in our education, some people never at all. And then we think of them as unusual and peculiar, and we can't understand them, and they're very difficult. I would put it to you, and I'd put it to our audience, that if we were to introduce these concepts and introduce young children to these ideas early on, they wouldn't seem so unfamiliar when they came to then the mathematical capabilities of understanding them and describing them. So I would, for all the educators in the room, I would say introduce quantum mechanics. At the moment you start talking about science and maths to children, but then I know not everyone agrees with me, but that's, I think, a really useful thing, because I think part of the problem is just lack of familiarity. So these characteristics will allow, for example, the new quantum computers that are in development, and they do not rely on bits that are either 0 or 1 in the way that we have at the moment with our computing. Instead, they harness the superposition of states, so that they're called qubits, and these can be in multiple states simultaneously. And this, what we need to know for our understanding of the implications of this, is that this means that there is enormous increase in computational capacity and speed. The two things, capacity and speed, beyond anything that's available today. These are not just supercomputers, right? This is another step, it's a huge step change in what we will be able to do with them. And they work differently. They provide us with different sets of information. And I should stress from the beginning that quantum technologies are additional technologies. We're not talking about substitutional technologies. That may happen, of course, as time goes on, as it often does with technologies, but at the moment, they're additional. And if you look through the history of technology, you'll see that it's almost always additional to what is already there, at least for a long period of time. They also, as many of you will know, signify that quantum computers will be powerful enough to break our sophisticated cryptography in our current digital networks. But, you know, when, as they say, God closes a door, God opens a window, we'll be able to create new, more secure ways of communicating using quantum entanglement devices. And this means also that our quantum entanglement devices will allow us to communicate in an extraordinarily secure way, in a way that we haven't been able to do before. Now, they're not perfect. Nothing will be perfect. No technology is perfect, but it is an additional way of increasing our security when it comes to information security. There are new sensors as well, quantum sensors that will provide information from around corners, deep underground, and transform the way in which we can build and monitor so much of our activity. So the rising significance of the range of quantum technologies, I think, is not yet fully recognized by policy decision makers, industrial decision makers, and also, I would say, our think tanks. All of these quantum technologies will be transformative. And I don't think we know yet what all of their applications will be. Some of these quantum technologies will be harder to achieve in terms of scale and practicality than others. And quantum computing is obviously taking longer than some of the other technologies. Some are already or soon to be embedded in industries, and some are a few years off that. But I think the important thing for decision makers and policy makers and policy thinkers, for what we need to know is that these technologies possess an unparalleled sensitivity to our environment. And they do things that cannot be done by other technologies and capabilities that we have. And several of these technologies will provide additional resilience within our critical infrastructure. And I'll go on to talk about some of that in a minute, particularly when it comes to our timing signals. They will require, of course, long-term investment and development. So this is a barrier for some countries. So how we do this, how we include countries, how we work together is a really important part of what might be the full benefit. So I just want to, if I have a moment, Sibylle, just looking at you now to give me a nod, to just quickly run through what I think are the main technologies that we need to be looking at the moment. And so the first is the really important thing about timing signals. So at the moment, all of our electronics are highly dependent on accurate timing signals. And they're primarily provided from space-based assets via low power and narrow frequency bands that are vulnerable to inaccuracies, degradation, drift, failure, jamming, interception, spoofing, data manipulation. We've got a whole set of problems, which you actually will be talking about in the next sessions when you're looking at cyber vulnerabilities of weapon systems and so on. Several ways to manage these to reduce the vulnerabilities have been proposed, and they include things like terrestrial radio systems, optical fiber timing signal transmissions, early warning issues, and increased technical redundancies. But we have the potential for catastrophic single point of failure through the whole of our critical infrastructure in almost every highly industrial country, and actually increasingly through developing countries as well, which is in some ways more of a concern. Our societies rely on all of these electronics to run our energy, our health, transport, financial systems, other infrastructure systems, and they can be interrupted through a technical failure or through a malicious act. So there is an urgency, and there's been a lot written about this, a lot in the public domain. And one of the ways in which quantum technologies could help out would be this new generation of quantum clocks that would help provide resilience, and it would at the same time enhance the accuracy of the timing signals and help future-proof the CNI for a considerable length of time. Now, I'm talking about additional technologies here, not substitutional, and that's really important. So, you know, when we have, for example, the GPS system, I don't know if any of you remember, but when Galileo was put up, there was a lot of, ruffled feathers, like, how very dare you put up the Galileo system? We already have a perfectly workable system. But then they understood that Galileo would provide an extra level of resilience. You have, 2 channels in Galileo, so already resilient. It's actually been designed to be more cyber secure in some ways. And also just increasing the ways in which the timing signals can come to our electronics increases our resilience. And the same will be true for our quantum technologies. So I'd just make that pitch that we're at a stage now where we can really assist in what is a really important concern. Quantum sensing, advanced sensors are a well-developed component now of the quantum technology suite, and there is a stage of development that could really help drive economies forward and improve the critical infrastructure. They can withstand penetration attacks. They can interact on the subatomic processes gather information on subatomic processes and materials, including at the cellular level in all living organisms. They have enormous use in our medical diagnostics and treatment. We can use them for really exquisite brain imaging, pinpoint imaging for gas leaks, mapping the deep urban infrastructure. We won't have to keep on digging up the road all the time, helping us see through fog, mists, camouflage, and other barriers like that. I think that people are not paying enough attention to the quantum sensing component of quantum technologies, which will have, I think, a really important role to play on the battlefield in terms of our military capabilities. Because, of course, all of these will have military application, and we can talk about that a bit more in the discussion and at the end, but I'm sure all of you can see what military additional capabilities they can provide at that level. We also have quantum key distribution, which is a mature already second generation quantum technology. It's been commercially available for over 15 years, and it exploits the principle of entanglement, which means that if quantum systems are intercepted or interrupted, the state collapses, and then the interruption is both disrupted and known. Quantum key distributions are not a panacea, but they do provide another level and a different way of providing cryptographic security. And then quantum computing, we've talked about that briefly, about the types of the type of capability that it will provide for us. And there are many experiments going on at the moment, new types of quantum computers that are being developed. Many competitive scientific teams are developing these, and I'm sure many of you know who are on the call that you can now go online and you can actually learn how to program quantum computers with some of the ones that are available for the general public to do that. And part of that as well, I think people aren't thinking enough about, and this will have real military technology, but also extraordinary capability for our civil life as well, and that's the use of quantum simulators, in which we will be able to predict, for example, if a material composed of a few hundred atoms can conduct electricity or behave as a magnet, or if a chemical reaction will take place. So quantum simulators, along with artificial intelligence, will transform the way in which we can help predict the possibilities that we have in our world. And of course, help us predict the likely technologies and ways forward in terms of our future. So I just want to end on this particular issue, which is really about how we think about technologies more generally. So we have this new set of transformative technologies. There are very few people in our think tank world, in our policy circles, who are talking about what these technologies might do for us. And yet they're upon us already. We always seem to be behind the curve in talking about this. And of course there are exceptions. I'm sure a number of people on the call go, not me, I'm there. And you are, and it's great. But the numbers of people involved in talking about this is quite low. In terms of the social sciences is what I'm talking about now, or the policymakers or the decision makers. Now, in the industrial decision-making, the science and technology decision-making in our governments, they're there. They have been making these decisions for years. They've been investing in these technologies. They've understood the significance. But our normal members of parliament, for example, are decision makers in terms of what we're doing for thinking through how our societies will transform, the future of work. Are they thinking about these technologies? I know our militaries are thinking about these technologies. Our arms controllers are beginning to, I think, but have they understood the full benefit of the technologies? Can we understand the full benefit and the full set of risks now? No, obviously not. And that's true even for the technologies that we have currently in deployment. There are always risks that we haven't understood. There are always new applications that we haven't understood, right? But should we be thinking about the range of possibilities? Absolutely. We may not get them all, but we could be thinking about the parameters, if you like, of that sphere as it goes forward into the future. And the other thing I think we need to think about is how we combine these quantum technologies with other technologies that are coming on stream. And I'm particularly interested in artificial intelligence in combination with quantum and what that might do. Learning machines, quantum learning machines, in other words. And I'm using the word artificial intelligence for the purists among us in the sort of, if you like, the layperson sense. So I mean machine learning. And then how would the new bio technologies work with quantum? And how would neuroscience work with these new quantum technologies? So I'm just leaving those as questions hanging. I don't have the answers to that, of course, but I think it's both exciting and a little bit scary, as all exciting things are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. This is really fascinating. As you said, also a bit scary. You've pointed out very clearly that already the range of quantum technologies that we have now are not sufficiently understood in the social sciences, in the policy world, and so on and so forth. And now you've added another layer of complexity. One of my favorite topics, the interconnectedness between the technologies, and you've briefly touched upon those. It would be great if you could elaborate a bit more where you see potential other connections, but then also how can we then address that? Governance of these quantum technologies, potential future regulation, upstream arms control, responsible innovation, when we would need to think about ways to address this. But how do you do that effectively when you have these complex technologies, infinite combinations with other technologies, and then all these stakeholders that need to get a grasp of it, which is very difficult? You're muted, Patricia.
Sorry, rookie error. It won't be infinite, absolutely not. But yeah, large numbers of combinations with other technologies, and some things that we can't yet think of that will become more and more obvious as you go through. I mean, I think if you look back to, for example, when the internet first came, nobody thought about cybersecurity, right? Nobody thought about that at all. So it wasn't built in. We've had to retrofit it, and it's not easy to retrofit, and we can see the results of that. I think you know, at the beginning of computing, nobody thought about, you know, personal computers, let alone ones that you carry around with you everywhere. You know, so these things unfurl as we go forward. And the visionaries, I guess, are almost always science fiction writers. So I would say we need to bring science fiction writers into our communities to talk with us. And I know that sounds like a wacky idea, but it's not actually. If you go through the history of science fiction writing, you'll see how those people who were thinking about the future societies, which, you know, they were creating, you know, future worlds, but nonetheless were imagining new technologies that are now in use. So for all the science sci-fi geeks and the Trekkies and everyone among us, you know, your time has come. Please come into the policy world. And I think as well, for those who are, if you like, more have a different profession thinking about the future, the futurologists, the futurists, the people who are looking at the future. And there are many organizations now that are doing that in different ways. Some are looking at catastrophic futures, some are looking at utopian futures and so on. But all of those people are thinking about these things, and we need to bring them into our discussion. I think we are in our world, in terms of the, you know, the military culture, the arms control culture, policy, international relations. We are very conservative in the way that we think about things, and we don't like to be thought of as a little bit kooky or a little bit unusual. So we like to be quite careful, and we like to deal with facts and figures, but we're missing things all the time. And in missing things, we are creating problems. We can't even see what's right in front of us sometimes, right? So many of us miss what is about to happen. And so we need to get a lot more open to new potential ideas, and not try to think of them as just being more of the same old, oh, it won't make much of a difference. Just think about how the internet has transformed our world and is continuing to do so. And then just imagine how these technologies that I've described, how they might do similar things. I mean, when we have the quantum internet, which is quantum computing connected with quantum communications, connected with quantum sensors, connected with artificial intelligence, and I suspect I suspect the human organism, we will be in a very different world. And that is being written about in various forms by science fiction writers. Is it being thought about by futurists? How many of us are reading them at the very least? How many of us are involving them in our discussions? I think that's my big question to our community.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Yes, truly mind-boggling. We have some great questions coming in, so I'll put a few to you. I'll do it by sets of 2 or 3. So the first one is about the effect of quantum computing on anti-submarine warfare. Will it be easier to hide submarines, or will it be easier to detect submarines? The second one is about verification, the potential use of quantum sensing technologies for verification, for example, for the NPT or the TPNW. And then the third question, whether quantum technologies could make weapons fully autonomous. So over to you.
So I don't think it would be necessarily quantum computing that will affect submarine warfare, but quantum sensors that will affect submarine warfare. And maybe that's what you meant. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word quantum, put the word computing after it. So one of the things I'd love to get away from, and if I can help in this discussion, is for us not to do that. Quantum technologies are a whole range, a whole suite of technologies which are using these specific characteristics of subatomic particles. So we need to think away from quantum computing. Quantum computing is really important, really transformative, etc. But there are other quantum technologies as well. Now, quantum computing, of course, will make a difference in terms of being able to calculate so much more, being able to simulate so much more, and of course, be able to crack old-fashioned cryptographic computer security. So that will all make a difference, and I'm sure it will make a difference to anti-submarine warfare. But quantum sensing, I don't know enough about the quantum sensors that are under development, but I would imagine that they will make a very big difference also to submarine warfare. Because of their ability to be able to see things. Now, it may not be necessary, right? So one of the things about new technologies, and so people who are really enthusiastic about what they're developing, you can see uses for all of them, but they're not always the best use of those technologies. You may be able to use a lesser technology than use the super duper new quantum technology, right? So we have to be very careful that we don't start thinking about quantum technologies for everything. It's not a panacea, and they won't necessarily provide us with better understanding or better knowledge about some things. We might be able to do that with just old-fashioned sensing. So a lot of these things will develop, but we need, and I think Dimitri is absolutely right to be questioning this, we need to start thinking about how will these quantum sensors make a difference for anti-submarine warfare, and we need to learn about them and then understand what the difference might be. And we need to think, and here I think we're not very good at this as a community. We need to think about the positives as well as the negatives. And that takes me to the next question, because the question is, will they have an impact on verification? The answer is yes, I think quite probably. If you're looking for small traces of materials, you could use quantum sensors to do that, or you could use a component of the quantum of the sensing to be quantum, and that might make a huge difference when you're looking for trace amounts. It might mean a much quicker, much faster analysis of what's going on somewhere, for example. So yes, I think that is very likely that we will see a difference in verification technologies from things like quantum sensors. And then the fully autonomous. So I think the issue with fully autonomous is a very difficult one, and I've talked about this in different forums. I don't know whether quantum technologies per se would make a difference. I just don't know enough about how that would work. Machine learning is already making a difference. And I think we're in a position at the moment where we really have to come to grips with what we mean by autonomous. Because this so-called autonomy, this so-called sort of ability for machines to make decisions is already happening. And the speed at which, and so machines can do things, some things better than us. And one of the things they can do better than us is analyze enormous amounts of data very quickly, which we can't do. And so when it comes to making decisions, for example, if we just take, autonomous cars, we might want to take, autonomous weapon strikes or semi-autonomous. I think we need to understand that at the moment, what we have is a situation in which the judgment that humans are making is, do I go with the machine or do I not go with the machine? Because the speed that we have to make that decision with the assistance that we get from the machines means that that's our binary decision. And that puts us in a terrible position, because then the human is made responsible for the decision, but actually the decision has really been to trust the machine or not. And this is a really big conversation that I know people are having all over the world. And I'm not sure how well we're having it in our community. I know in the lethal autonomous weapons systems discussion in Geneva, this is being discussed all the time. And it's a non-trivial discussion. It's a really difficult. It isn't, there are autonomous decision-making machines and then there are humans in the loop. It's not like that. In reality, it's not like that. And that will be true for almost all of the machines that we will be inventing that use machine learning, can make independent decisions. And we have to think this through, because putting humans in the loop is not necessarily the solution, because it just puts them into a terrible position where they're held responsible for something that they're not actually responsible for. Okay, so that was those 3 questions.
Great. Yes. Thank you very much. We actually have plenty of excellent questions, so I'll put 2 more to you. One takes us back to the issue of lack of knowledge by policymakers. So what the question is, how do we solve that problem, not just for quantum, but also more broadly for emerging tech?
Well, so one of the ways I think in which we can help as a community is for our community to understand these technologies and to be incorporating them into our research and to be thinking about them. In my reading on this, there are very few of us. It's growing, and it's great that the Stockholm Security Conference is addressing this. It's a trailblazer, and I think that we need to be doing a lot more of this. And there are many things you can join. There's for example, the EU Quantum Flagship you can join. You can read about all of these things. You can. There are other big quantum technology conferences, and part of it is familiarity, just becoming familiar with the ideas, reading about it, trying to sort of fit it into what your current state of knowledge is and understanding, keeping an open mind, not becoming overexcited, which is always my problem, but not also just pouring cold water over things. We've got many examples of people who've done both with other technologies. Try to see what these new technologies might provide, and then think about how that might work within your area of knowledge, and see if that might start to make a difference and incorporate it into that. I would say from the social sciences perspective, that would be the way to go. And then, of course, if the think tanks are thinking about them, and the policy institutes at universities, etc., perhaps working with their quantum labs, and there are many quantum labs around the world, then I think we'll start to get a much healthier discussion about what these technologies will mean for our societies and for the future of, for example, defense, arms control, etc.
Great, thanks. So there are two questions that build on that further. One is how to persuade funders to put resources into developing next-gen expertise on these issues. And then linked to that, the question, what should we prioritize, converting first-generation quantum computing, sensing practitioners, or upskilling current arms control researchers who may come from the social sciences? And then taking the point further that you had earlier also about responsible science, could you suggest some principles of responsible science that would be appropriate for mitigating the security risks that come from quantum technologies?
So I think, I mean, if I had ever understood how to persuade funders to put their resources into something I wanted to do, I would have had a very different career. It's a really difficult one. I think that it's part of, I mean, we have a bigger problem, don't we, in that, you know, old-fashioned arms control, if you like, has really sort of fallen by the wayside in terms of funding from the big funders, the foundations, and the big governments. And this is a much bigger conversation. I'm not going to get into the whys and wherefores of that now. So one of the things that might happen is, you know, if you could persuade funders to sort of fund this, then maybe that would open up some new areas, some new people. I mean, the other thing to do is to think about it a bit differently and maybe think about going from the scientific and technology point of view and seeing if we can get funding for social sciences to interact with the science and technology research funds to look at the social implications. I think that that's maybe very interesting. I'm sure that there are universities doing this now at the academic level. And the way I see our work tending to go is that we tend to have, you know, the in-depth fundamental research done in our university system. Our policy think tanks, non-governmental organizations that think about these things, I make a plug for Vertic, for example, will be taking these issues up then as sort of the next wave of connecting with these. And then, you know, they start to understand the implications and they start taking it into governmental thought in terms of, you know, what we might think about, for example, about controlling, or what we might think about, you know, responsible deployment, ethics, and so on. And it's at that point, I think, that governments often, particularly you know, if we start looking at sort of, you know, the Geneva agenda or the Vienna agenda, or New York in the UN, or at the bilateral, it's at that point that governments think that the issue starts. And it doesn't, of course. It started decades beforehand in academia. So my go-to is always, what's academia doing? And it can be very obtuse. It can be really hard to fathom your way through. I mean, unless you've got, you know, PhD in quantum physics to fathom your way through what's going on in academia, you know, 10 years ago. Or unless you've got, you know, a PhD in the arcane language, which I think is actually worse than quantum physics, of international relations, then, you know, it's really hard to work out what's happening there in terms of political theory and so on. So one of the shortcuts we could do is to make a better connection between our universities and the policy think tanks. And I know universities have tried to do that with their own policy institutes, but I'm wondering if it might have been smarter to have connected better with the existing policy institutes or policy think tanks and NGOs that already know how to do this policy work and to harness the interaction. So I guess that's what I would try to do. I don't know if that's answered your question, but yeah, I think it's just one of those things that as time goes on, it will become more and more obvious that we need to do some work on that. Whether that will come through our current set of funders, I doubt somehow. But I'd love to be proved wrong. In terms of a code of conduct, well, I guess we don't yet know, I think, the full, even the beginnings of the scope of what all of these technologies might mean in terms of the ethics. But I think that there's a general underlying principle that should apply to all of our work on science technology in terms of what the costs and the benefits and the risks are. And what I would suggest, and again, I've been banging on about this my whole career, which is now, unfortunately, a very long time. And that is that we really need to teach ethics at the school and undergraduate level as a required part of science training. And we don't. It's often an elective. A lot of people take it out of interest, but most of our universities, I'm sure some do, but most of our universities do not require that training. And it's a huge lost opportunity to get people when they're young and thinking about these things and to educate them. So that's what I would do. I don't know, Anastasia, whether you've got an idea.
We're actually getting close to the end of the session. I think we should have actually scheduled a whole day for content, because I think we have plenty. We could have done a whole film.
Come back.
Exactly. So we'll do more. But one more question that I'd like to put to you is about geopolitics. Is Europe on the quantum ball, or only the US and China? Think 10 years ahead.
Oh no, Europe's on the quantum ball. Oh yes, definitely. We have the quantum flagship, the EU quantum flagship, and the European Union's invested quite considerably. And the UK, no longer part of the EU, but nonetheless also on the quantum ball. I would say it's not only the US and China, Russia is definitely there, Australia is there. And if you want me to talk about AUKUS and its connection to quantum, I can. So there's all sorts. I would say India is, definitely got the chops, if not yet the investment. They've definitely got the this is the thing. It's the same as cyber and the internet. Brain power is what we need right now. And, we have extraordinary mathematicians and physicists in many countries around the world, in many African countries, in many Asian countries, in many Latin American countries. And all of them could be doing this with the right investment. So it was the same for cyber technologies. And it was actually in some ways quite a leveler up if you could just invest that brain power.
Thanks. Then we can actually fit in quickly one more question, which is from a quantum physicist who voices some concern that the predictions are so difficult about the actual applications of the technologies, and that creates a lot of uncertainty. Could you conclude, as some reflections on that, and any concluding points before I wrap up?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. But I love uncertainty, so that's great. So we don't know, of course, but the thing is that we can only know in some ways with the proof of concept and the proof of how it will work, and as time goes on. But my point is, if we don't start learning about it now and educating ourselves within the policy community, and we will be behind the game. And then what will happen is we'll be doing what we did with the internet. We'll be thinking about it when it's already too late. We thought about cybersecurity, but it became almost impossible then to retrofit the internet. It wasn't set up to be safe and secure for people online, because it was supposed to be just a small, community-based network, and it grew. And so I'm not saying that in educating ourselves we'll fix everything. We won't, but we'll increase our chances of helping to think things through more maturely, in a more considered way. That's all I'm asking for. I'm not saying that we'll do everything perfectly if we do this, but I'm saying that I think we'll increase our chances of doing things better if we educate ourselves now. I mean, as I say, the best time to start was 20 years ago. The next best time to start is now. So that's what I would say to you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. This was truly fascinating, and I'm glad that the SSC doesn't end here, and also that we will continue the theme of the future of warfare into the next year and the next years, because there's plenty to explore. There's also plenty of work to do to educate ourselves, to engage between the social sciences, between the natural sciences, to engage with the next generation. And to conclude, actually, I was in the SIPRI library yesterday, and I was pulling out some books, one on outer space and the future of warfare from 1978, one on artificial intelligence from 1987. So these discussions have been around for some time. So as he said, we really need to focus on that to find solutions and to anticipate risks going forward. So big thanks also to the SIPRI team, to my colleague Vitaly Furchenko and other physicists who helped me screen the questions. And again, thank you so much, Patricia, for taking the time to enlighten all of us about the range of quantum technologies. So
that's great. Thank you so much, Sibylle. Thank you, SIPRI. Thank you, everybody, for contributing your thoughts and questions. Really appreciate it.